Session number 3, here we are. So, I'm given the honor to moderate the third session, which is titled Non-Human, Furry Identities and Trans-Species Perspectives. And so first, I have the pleasure of welcoming Alec Esther, who is going to be talking about brushing up against species, transgender feminist world building through fursuit practices.
Thank you so much. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. I like brushing my fursuit. I have an entire barber kit in my fursuit bag, which includes a boar bristle brush, a wicker brush made exclusively for faux fur, and a dinky green comb that's my favorite of them by far. The first time I nailed the brush job of my fursuit maker said that my fursuit's sole, exact wording, had inaugurally aligned with my own. I finally looked like the tiger I was meant to be. Fursuits are cultural productions typically associated with the furry fandom. In my case, I wear a fursuit created by Shanjun Gongfang, literally Tiger Workshop, a Chinese fursuit making studio that built my fursuit based on my fur measurements and a drawn reference of my character, Stevie. I don't, however, consider myself a furry in the traditional sense. I consider myself a Therian, or someone whose soul aligns with that of an animal, in this case, a tiger. What qualifies my Therian nature is that I experience debilitating species dysphoria, a reality as confusing as much as it provides a sense of closure. I look down at my hands, and I see paws. This phantom limbing acts as a metaphor for a larger epistemological underpinning. I see humanity only as a conceptual other, a thing that I am occupying incorrectly, a categorical error which the constitution of anthro-animal reality would rectify. But how do we begin that constitution? The goal of this presentation is to illustrate that the delegation of furry desires through the materiality of the fursuit parallels the analytics of transgender feminist desires for new worlds, which expands gender to include species. I make the claim that species is gender by evaluating fursuit practices from the perspective of the transitive, or Claire Colebrook's belief in, quote, refusal of the drama of radical distance and difference between forms of life, arguing a similarity between the cross-species and transgender desires that we both harbor and the theories that we use to realize them. Making these connections solidifies a place in feminist work for evaluating species as an identity worthy of positional conjugation and creating space within that work for ontological expansion. A critical analysis of the fursuit starts with putting Stevie on, or, more accurately, with an analysis of that phrasing. To put on means to don something, but it can also mean to put someone onto something, or to introduce them to something new. Putting Stevie on puts people on to Stevie. It invites them into the fiction of my reality, onto the field of feline potential that my tigerness generates. Putting him on is an invitation into another world. Yet to put on can also mean to deceive, to put on an act that is not real. I assume this is what most people believe is happening when I put Stevie on. I am deceiving them, forcing them to believe in a collective fiction of anthro-animal existence. To my audience, it's simply entertainment, something to put on for their amusement and turn off when it turns them off. Once there's no longer interest in the fantasy of Stevie, my feline reality dissolves. I'm left alone to take him off. Thus is the complication of putting him on. I am always thinking of what will turn him off and who he will turn off when I become him, because not everyone, after all, is into that. But there are many who are into that. The phrase to turn off is polysemous, but in furry fandom, its myriad meanings feel confluent. The supposed hypersexuality of the furry fandom is a trope as old as tales, and all the discourse surrounding it is pure noise, but it is also true that Stevie has received a substantial amount of sexual attention, and that an informed reading of that sexual attention could exhibit its sociocultural reasoning. Some of that attention has been, I admit, self-manufactured. I've posted a Twitter thirst trap here, a pat on the bed video there, and it's all been in good fun. This is not a humble brag. But what complicates matters is kind of the reason why it isn't a humble brag. It's about how unwanted that sexual attention can be after the fact. Putting Stevie on is an invitation into another world. However, that invitation is so often seen as sexual, no matter the content of it, that it becomes off-putting. A turn-off for me as much as it turns off Stevie. In Living a Feminist Life, Sarah Ahmed speaks of sexual assault and harassment as world-shaping. At the time, each time something happens, you're thrown. You begin to feel a pressure, this relentless assault on the senses. A body in touch with a world can become a body that fears the touch of a world. This rhetoric demonstrates that the furry bodies, like Stevie's, that invite others into their world are somatically seen as the sites of that invitation. Stevie's body is in touch with a world of furry pleasure. The fur I brush so lovingly becomes someone else's brush with that world. And then a brush with furry pleasure becomes a brush up against me, a brush along the shoulders, between the thighs, places to which they were not invited. But consent is expected because the ontological transformation that such brushing engenders is the invitation you gave in the first place, simply by existing. It's not enough to say that costuming is not consent. The mere presence of fur is anticipatory, an invitation into a world that must be taken by force. Your body is a world unto them, and you can't turn it off. I construe this audience response, however, as a form of dysphoria inherent to the distance between fur and flesh that I myself resemble in suit, which recontextualizes the entire MO of furry intimacy itself. When in suit, I become a materiality, a fetish object through which others can brush up against the world. I become a marker of difference that is at once tangible, fur as not skin, and yet claimable through their desires to be one with it. This metaphor is also how I understand my own dysphoria. The exteriority of species simultaneously signifies its efficaciousness, yet also its unattainability. Andrea Longchu herself recounts this dysphoria for trans women as a zero-order disappointment that fulfills itself. Call this the romance of disappointment. You want something. You have found an object that will give you what you want. One day, you tell yourself, it will give you what you want. Then, one day, it doesn't. Now it dawns on you that your object will probably never give you what you want. But this is not what's disappointing. Not really. What's disappointing is what happens next. Nothing. You keep your object. You continue to follow it around, stash it in a drawer, water it, tweet at it. It still doesn't give you what you want, but you knew that. You have had another realization. Not getting what you want has very little to do with wanting it. Knowing better usually doesn't make it better. You don't want something because wanting it will lead to getting it. You want it because you want it. This is the zero-order disappointment that structures all desire and makes it possible. After all, if you could only want things you were guaranteed to get, you would never be able to want anything at all. In this case, Therian becoming through the fursuit approximates, though may not equal, the simultaneous being and not being of gender dysphoria. But the objectification of which Longchu speaks reflects others' desires to see me as tiger as well. To others, I am the object of which Longchu speaks, just as becoming tiger is the object of which she speaks to me. The energy that Stevie ostensibly radiates puts others onto a new world. Others capitalize on the erotic potential of that world. Yet that world is inscribed by its distance from our own, a dysphoric response that permeates the sexual desires of others as well. To brush against me is to witness the potential of a furry world through Stevie. Sexuality, then, is an expression of desire for that world, a desire to come closer to it. To echo Longchu, they don't want Stevie because wanting him or me will lead to getting him. They want him because they want it. The sexuality of furries is in fact a technique proffered to close the gap between our worlds. This logic, perhaps polemically, argues that I see the sexualities of furries as dysphoria by any other name, that the erotic desires of distance materialize in desires to claim that which is essentialized as other, furriness. The materiality of my fur incites desires that I cannot turn off for the same reason that I can't turn dysphoria off. If it were not efficacious, it would not be desired. I would not be desired. I reckon with their desires thus as desires for proximity to species, for material truth and reification of another world in which people like me may live. This recontextualization of furry desires as dysphoric attachments to a potential world connects furry desires to a world-building project that fulfills them, transgender feminism. Longchu ends on liking women by stating that trans women want things too, which is a rallying cry for understanding desire as a focal point of becoming rather than a deposit of despair. When we both speak of desire and the dysphorias that result from it, we are both speaking to a desire to expand systems of identity to incorporate that which we are and long to be, which are one and the same. Hence, this theory is both indebted and responsive to transgender theory because, like the desires of trans women, furry desires go beyond those of sex. More accurately, the dysphoria, the longing for another world that furry desires exhibit is a gender of sorts, an expression of being that is as socially constructed by non-transitive divides, the non-human and human binary, and cis-heteropatriarchy respectively, as it is an instinctive epistemological force. There are those that will not believe in my species dysphoria, much like they may not believe in gender dysphoria. I don't give a fuck. Regardless of that acceptance, transgender feminist theory argues the duality of dysphoria, that the circular desire to be what one already is sustains the playing field of one's becoming. Arguing for an analytic of furry desires thus begins with understanding that even the most base of those desires are indicative of the need for contact beyond simple touch. I wish to conclude with an intervention that may guide further debate on the role of trans species gender from a gender abolitionist perspective, which connects this discussion of humanity to a discourse most critical of humanity's supposedly neutral construction: race. In System Failure, Essays on Blackness and Cisgender, Marquise Bay argues that, quote, the language of matching, integral to cisgender, has embedded within it a troubling assumption that there is a way to match one's given sex, which means that there is a right way to be male or female. Therefore, that system cannot actually accommodate blackness because it is a, quote, determinative propulsive force for how one ought to rightly behave as the sex they have been bestowed, which automatically pinpoints blackness as gender deviance. This leads to what they call system failure, which, quote, undoes what the human is and works towards creating something new in its wake. It may be appropriate to redefine species not as a system of gender, then, but as a horizontal system of transitivity beyond distinct categorization. As evident in Bay's argumentation, blackness escapes standardized notions of gender. Expanding a colonial system to include species subverts the very same power that transitivity proclaims to have. For this reason, it's best to return to transitivity as a rejection of binarist powers in the first place, a way of reflexively understanding species as malleable to empower those who may have been excluded from the human altogether, including, as Bay argues, black people. In more stark terms, indebting this species' dysphoric work to system failure specifically argues for a collapsing of gender into species because gender is species, not the other way around. Gender in the Bayian theoretical model is an oppressive classification that assumes a human body with which a soul may be aligned, like the one my fursuit maker clocked. Gender relies on this theorization of this assignment, which excludes certain people, namely in the Bayian context, black people, from ever supposedly becoming human in the first place. But species is never given the supposed privilege of assignment in the first place. It's an assumed default that excludes by default. The assignments required of both categories establish gender as inherently categorically incorrect. Therefore, abolishing gender becomes an act of abolishing alignment, which allows for the desires of furries to algebraically return a value that is in line with the world they want to make, just as system failure allows for transness to become a spectral default rather than a marginal state of being. The dysphorias that rule both worlds, such as those of furry desires and those of transgender women, can then be considered not merely responses to assumed humanness or assumed gender, but rather liberative impulses, ones that situate subjectivity within the generative force of the immanent rather than the determinant. Today, I've used the technology of the fursuit to imagine a different world, one that rejects systems of cisness and species wholesale because of the desires that fuel those becomings themselves. When my fursuit maker stated that my fursuit soul and myself were aligned, he simply meant to compliment my skill with the brush. But that skill with the brush allows others to brush up against worlds not yet known to us. Intimate desires in furry contexts signal longing for another world, a world that, when brushed up against, arouses the spirit and envisions greater becomings than what the non-transitive indicate is possible, laying bare that species is just a costume in its own right. Taking off that costume we call Stevie is off-putting for me, as I return to a state of dysphoric skin scratching and nail biting out of a misalignment with myself. There's a reason I don't own a webcam. I question in those moments whether it's worth taking it off at all. But in the words of Sarah Ahmed, to be in question is to question being. And if my being is a question, that may continue to be asked and to one day be answered, because there is no question that this desire is worth it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alec. It was a truly, really inspirational presentation, and I appreciate your engagement with race, which is so often not talked about in these conversations. Up next, we have Transspecies Panic, the Furry Slope of Anti-Trans Legislation with Alex Rudenshiold and Caro Mooney.
Cool. Okay. Is it sharing on Zoom? Do you know? It is, right?
Yeah, this is
okay,
going
cool.
through
Sweet.
yes.
All right. I'm standing over here so I can navigate the slides. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks to the other presenters, as well as to the Conference Organizing Committee and PLU for putting together this incredible, a little bit closer, okay. This incredible conference. My name is Alex Rudenshiold. I'm a PhD candidate in Film and Media Studies at UC Irvine, and I'm co-presenting with Disembodied Voice. Caro, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Caro Mooney. I'm a Criminology Law and Society PhD student at UC Irvine, and I'm excited to be here today.
Cool, yeah, the voice of God. We're presenting today about a sort of recent media, legislative, and rhetorical attack on furry here in the US. So yeah, here's a sort of a group of different objects with which you may be familiar. There's a 2016 post from a Christian blog which says that children exposed to furries are identifying as cats in schools, and that schools are accommodating this by providing identity-affirming bathrooms for them, litter boxes in classrooms. 2022 video of a right-wing activist repeating the same sort of myth at a school board meeting. We can watch a little bit of it, actually. I think it's illuminating.
The agenda that is being pushed through our schools is just my opinion, but somewhat nefarious when it comes to some of the activities. So let's talk about furries. It was addressed by a child a couple months ago that they are put in an environment where there are kids that identify as a furry, a cat or a dog, whatever. And so yesterday I heard that at least one of our schools in our town has in one of the unisex bathrooms, a litter box for the kids that identify as cats. And I am really disturbed by that. And I will do some more investigation on that. I know it's going on nationwide. I know it is. It's part of the agenda that's being pushed. I don't even want to.
All right, that's enough. It's part of the agenda, and she's doing her own research, so you know it's going to be really fruitful. About Furies. And there's a 2023 statement from Florida FurCon Megaplex, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, explaining that they decided to make their convention 18 plus in response to legislation banning minors from adult performances, which was targeted at drag shows, but also caught Megaplex. And then a 2025 bill from the Texas legislator called the FURRIES Act, which seeks to ban anthropomorphic acts and play from public schools. Our presentation is a sort of preliminary attempt at understanding what connects these things, as well as how they relate specifically to anti-transgender legislation efforts by the far right. Caro is going to start us off with an overview of the state of anti-trans legislation in the US, and then I'll talk a little bit about the anti-furry moral panic media, which led to this current wave of anti-furry legislation. And then Caro's going to take it back with some representative examples from the bill texts and the relationship to anti-trans legislation. And then I'll give a preliminary gloss of the sort of philosophical and rhetorical underpinnings of this right-wing movement. So take it away, Caro.
All right, hello. So I predominantly study anti-trans legislation, so I want to start off by placing this discussion of anti-furry legislation into an anti-trans legal history. We can start off in the US. In around 1843 in Ohio, we have the first ordinance that made it illegal to cross-dress. And the criminalization of cross-dressing really served to allow clothing to be justification for police harassment, raids, and arrests up until the 1980s. Around the 1990s, we see a shift into a civil rights gaining movement. During this period, trans people are added into existing anti-discrimination protected classes. So we're seeing sex and gender expanded in their definitions to allow trans protections. We're seeing gender aligning ID updates. And overall, we're feeling kind of optimistic about a rights gaining direction for trans people in the law. And then we get to the past decade. So around 2014, we have a big pivot where bathroom bills really burst onto the scene, right? This started with the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, where there was a vote that was overturned by an extreme margin. It was a real surprise outcome, using the rhetoric that allowing trans women into women's restrooms would make cis women vulnerable to sexual assault. And this was the first time this was really strategized in politics, and it was so successful that it really expanded to all these different states where they were trying to overturn different types of anti-discrimination ordinances. This was stopped with North Carolina's HB 2. If we're familiar with this was essentially when they had national championships and these massive, I think it was a lot of concerts that were touring specifically that pulled out because they wouldn't go to venues in a state that was considered anti-queer, anti-LGBT. And this ended up costing the state of North Carolina $3.76 billion, right? Billion. And so that kind of targeting really sent conservatives back to the drawing board, right? They said, oh my God, $3.76 billion. We gotta drop the bathrooms, we're gonna take a second. And they spent some time replotting and returned to the people that we often don't see as having full rights-bearing access, and that would be minors. So they came back into the scene around 2021, focusing on academic spaces, athletics, and healthcare for trans youth. And this is the second wave of anti-trans legislation. And this is where we see furry really come into the picture for the first time at the end of this wave in the last few years. You can see these two graphs here demonstrating the kind of timelines. You can see that pink there is all these bathroom bills, and then we've got the blue, green, and tan color representing the youth-centered bills in the second wave. All right, and here is anti-trans legislation map style. I've focused on youth in this map on the left because I want to focus on the educational spaces that these anti-furry bills are talking about. As we can see, the anti-furry map corresponds to the darker anti-trans youth map. We have Texas, Florida, we have Mississippi, Oklahoma, North Dakota. I want to quickly note that Florida is a bit of an outlier here. Most of these are dealing with educational spaces for youth. Florida's was actually an it was an anti-drag bill that banned gender performances that ended up encapsulating some of the things involved in Megaplex, and Megaplex ended up having to restrict attendance that year. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this. So this demonstrates how anti-trans legislation can restrict furry events and spaces beyond education as well. But these 4 red states that we're looking at here are where our bills that were directly aimed at educational spaces are located.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that I want to highlight that media moral panic functions against both trans people and furries. The basis for a lot of media coverage lies in pathologization. So the definition of difference into disorder, in this case, mental illness, right? This occurs in academic and popular spaces, but shared by transgender and furry people is the pathologization of identity and cultural practice, respectively, into erotic target identity inversion disorders. So that would be autogynephilia and autoanthropomorphozoophilia, respectively. Mouthful on the second one. Both directly and ambiently, this creates the conditions for to justify negative legacy media coverage, especially in the Daily Mail and New York Post. But Fox News is actually a good example of somehow a less sensational way that this occurs. You can see panicky furry in schools coverage of fellow furry academic Tofty Alpaca was criticized is categorized rather in Fox News as true crime. Also feeding this now are social media hoaxes, which are hyperbole, like fetishistic and moralizing, and they are encouraged by social media engagement metrics, which keep people money. Also, active learning, it's true crime, folks. This brings us to the sort of thing that kicks all off. The largest of these panics, which has had a wave of aftershocks, is the litter boxes in schools hoax from the beginning of this. This began when an activist from the far-right anti-queer group Moms for Liberty spoke on video saying that schools were accommodating kids identifying as cats' bathroom preferences by providing litter boxes in classrooms. This is picked up by far-right mega influencer Chaya Raichik, also known as Libs of TikTok, who skyrockets it into the halls of U.S. and international legislatures, happened in the UK as well, especially through representatives like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene. We're focusing on state bills, so here's a little clip from the Missouri legislature in 2022, which shows just how established this media pipeline is.
One of the most bizarre things that I've learned about this year called furries. Have you heard of furries? I have not heard of furries. If I'm pronouncing it correctly, this is where people think that they are a cat or a furry animal. And I guess it's cats because they've even gotten some schools, I don't think it's in Missouri yet, where they have litter boxes that they can go use the restroom in.
Did you see those off of Libs of TikTok?
Say what now?
Have you ever heard of Libs of TikTok on Twitter?
I have not.
I've seen something.
I'm going to call bullshit on that. But this whole thing is pretty quickly and handily debunked. You can see, like, even Joe Rogan issued a retraction, which he doesn't usually do that. Nevertheless, it has continued to spawn more and more efforts to criminalize furries, and as we'll see, to use furries as a rhetorical edge case through which to further criminalize transgender identities as well. So there are 5 bills we're talking about here. And we've split them up into 2 categories. So there's anti-trans bills with a furry element. Usually this is an expansive definition of transgender, which positionally includes a trans species clause, which can be amended out. That's these 3. And then there are explicitly anti-furry bills, which are designed to target furries without other identities attached. We'll be talking about these 3. Feel free to ask about the other 2 in the Q&A. But yeah, here, Kara, you can take it back now.
All right, so I'm going to start off here with a bill called the FURRIES Act. There is no S in the full title, but that's fine. It's called Forbidding Unlawful Representation of Role-Playing in Education, and this bill is in Texas. This came on the heels of Governor Abbott in Texas making the same unsubstantiated claim that kids are going to school dressed up as cats with litter boxes in their classrooms. So it prevented any public school code of conduct from allowing students on days outside of special days marked as like Halloween and things like that to present as anything other than a human being. So we have this kind of engagement here that we've got on the screen that highlights this rhetorical move happening where the person introduced the bill is asked, do you think it's a good use of our time to write laws based on debunked internet conspiracy theories? And he answers, well, this piece of legislation before us covers that, among other things that are true. So we know that this is false, and we're introducing this bill on a basis of something that was knowingly not done. That's a really unique legal move here that we see in this Texas bill. The next one we have is Oklahoma Peak. And OK Peak is creating an OK Peak account for students in trigger districts, which are districts that hold money to pay for the cost of the homeschooling for these kids because the students have ideologically inappropriate public school options. This is essentially going to punish any school that has too much left-leaning curriculum by making them pay the students in their district so that those parents could homeschool the child away from left-leaning ideology. We have the highlighted quotes here that relate to trans and furry identities. So instruction in gender identity and sexual orientation, including instruction designed to promote gender confusion, the presence of any school employee or volunteer engaged in anthropomorphic behavior, commonly referred to as furries. Here we have adults only mentioned, which is a bit of a standout there. And then curriculum promoting animal rights activism. Not exactly sure how relevant that is, but it was unique, so we decided to mark it as well. And then our third example, we have an anti-pronoun bill out of North Dakota. The North Dakota preferred pronouns and providing accommodations to a transgender student to provide a penalty and declare an emergency bill. So here we have essentially a bill that's banning any sort of policy that supports using the pronouns of a trans student, that supports some sort of accommodation for trans students, or that adopts a policy establishing or providing a place, facility, school program, or accommodation that caters to a student's perception of being any animal species other than human. So this bill passes, but look what happens here. This is the mechanism that's really interesting with these. We have the entire reference to some sort of trans species identity crossed out, and what's replaced is essentially something that allows them to sue and incur financial gain if they feel targeted by being forced to use a child's pronouns at some point.
Yeah, so these media and legislative attacks on trans people and furry essentially function through slippery slope arguments, right? These are right-wing arguments, to be clear. They're essentially arguments which figure queer progress as a continuing decline of human society's given natural and cultural truth. Obviously, those are both constructed categories. Attacks on furry situate trans species identities at the bottom of the slope, the most unnatural. Thus, these arguments are often run in reverse, narrating that if furry is currently being inflicted on children, the most vulnerable group in society, that this is evidence that we're at a cultural low which needs to be walked back. The positional argument figures furry as an extreme or absurd element, which may make attacking or legislating away the more real threat, in quotes there, to right-wing essentialists, which would be trans or otherwise queer life, makes legislating that away seem more reasonable. To illustrate, on the left you can see a sort of gray equivocation or so rights paradox version of this argument, in which the distinction between one position and the other is unclear. On the right is a more straightforward domino version in which A would naturally lead to B. Allowing for trans people leads to trans species, unnaturalness or something. So, like, on what basis are these claims made? The assumption that trans identity or even furry performance, which is often intentionally misrepresented in the right wing as like biological trans species essentialism, is that the idea that this is unnatural or abnormal is drawn from a lineage of primarily Christian essentialist philosophy in which, one, non-procreative sex is unnatural, so you can think of like single women or lesbians who are not procreating, gay men who are having non-procreative sex, or trans people who they imagine can't have procreative sex. And two, that the human is defined by being not animal, which I'm sure many people have thoughts about. We've heard about that today. But on the right, this is a way that furry is portrayed to be trans species, again, in this essentialist biological notion, or even participants in bestiality, which obviously is like not allowed within the fandom or without. So to try and put it kind of succinctly, I know this is like a crazy slide. Far-right rhetoric portrays furry as an extreme, unnatural outcome currently operating in society by misrepresenting it as biologically essentially trans species, which is then presented as a downstream effect of allowing trans people to be full participants in society. This logic follows that to stem the spreading tide of furry, then one must prevent the spread of trans people, as if either of those things are really possible. The effect is largely immeasurable, but as Caro can attest, furry and trans species identity are regularly invoked in legislative floor discussion of non-furry anti-trans bills. And as I'm sure we've all seen, frequently these kinds of rhetorics lead to increased stochastic violence against queer people and furries alike. Sorry, it's really downer, but that's the end of it. Excited to talk to you all about it.
Thank you so much for another important work. It's really, really great to hear, honestly. Up next, we have Belle Walston, who's going to be doing a presentation on Sparklefurs, virtual avatars, physical embodiment, and intergenerational histories in the furry fandom.
Hi, guys. Let me share my screen. All right, cool. So, hi, I'm Belle. This is my presentation, Sparklefurs, virtual avatars, physical embodiment, intergenerational histories in the furry fandom. Also, thank you so much, Mark, for the shout out earlier. It was sweet and very unexpected. Just a little bit about me and where I'm coming from. I graduated with my MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin just last spring, and this presentation is taken from my thesis of the same name. So, a year before I started my grad program, I saw pictures of this exhibition, Sparkle Heaven, on Twitter. It was the culmination of a summer research project by artist Freddie Batts, aka Sparklecast 2009, held at its university student art gallery for a few days. I really resonated with the images that Batts posted and related to the affective comments left by other furries about the exhibition. Many of them were from people sharing their own original artwork or reminiscing about playing on the computer when they were kids. Seeing Batts' exhibition is when I started to become interested in contemporary representations of Sparklefurs as keeping ideas taken up from a specific moment in the furry fandom's past frozen in time. So before I go too much further, I just want to be explicit about what I consider a Sparklefur to be for the sake of this project. Though funny animal fans had been communicating virtually since the 80s using services like bulletin board systems, Usenet groups, and multi-user dungeons, the development of image-centric web browsers like Mosaic in 1993 and the increasing accessibility of home computers is what skyrocketed the reach of the furry fandom. By 2008, 75% of American households owned a personal computer versus just 15% in 1990. A new generation of furries, digital natives like myself, people who are too young to remember life before the internet, found the fandom as children through gallery websites like DeviantArt. And networking on a gallery website required a level of candor. Artists were expected to maintain profiles about themselves and flesh them out with biographies and other identifying information that would be associated with their work. Personas were developed as a means of visually embodying oneself in the aesthetic language of the furry fandom while navigating that inhabitable virtual gallery space. Sparklefurs appealed to these young artists because they were colorful, fantastical, and drew upon popular media properties and subcultures. If one's parents forbid them to listen to alternative metal or shop at Hot Topic, they could express themselves online through their personas' accessories and animalistic traits. But as you may or may not remember yourself, Sparkle Dog originated as a derogatory term. I showed this DeviantArt stamp during my Contemporary Sparkle Dogs panel at Lone Star FurCon 2025, and an attendee approached me after my presentation to say that though he had loved Sparkle Dogs, he put this exact anti-Sparkle Dog stamp on his own childhood DeviantArt profile. He explained to me that he had felt self-conscious about liking Sparkle Dogs and that the stamp was a way of deflecting his attachment and protecting himself. Pretending not to like Sparkle Dogs was preferable to being ridiculed. So all that to say, in the late aughts and early 2010s, openly identifying with a Sparklefur persona was embarrassing. A Sparklefur was the kind of thing you'd most likely relegate to the margins of your notebook or shyly upload to your DeviantArt gallery, not something you paint on a big canvas and hang in an art gallery. But I'm seeing more and more contemporary artists represent Sparklefur subjects with respect and reverence, and I wanted to try to write about why. The first thing I do in my thesis is write a formal analysis of this painting by Mark Zubrovich, who you all know and love by now. In Bruce as Sparkle Dog, Mark's persona Bruce embodies characteristics that are desirable yet normally unattainable. Not only is he a blue dog, but he's classically nude. He's holding that golden sword and he's got wings sprouting from his back and these rainbow rays emanating off of them. His tongue and tail and penis are neon and elongated and curling like they have the ability to move freely. And Bruce has been physically realized as Mark builds up all these textures on the jute, which he talked about being rough and heavy and fibrous in a way that canvas isn't. He's included glitter and aquarium rocks and even a little sticker of a bird right here kind of on Bruce's shoulder blades. It all gives the sense of Bruce being animated, not like in a series of illustrations, but as a living being who is in, can interact, and be physically interacted with in the world. In the past, Sparklefurs were almost always digital subjects, but Bruce's body doesn't exist in fantasy. You can encounter him in a physical space, run your hands across him if the artist lets you, see the light reflected in his fur. Starting from here helped me articulate that children who develop their aesthetic sensibilities in the furry fandom are now adults with the means and experience to address disconnection from their bodies and imagine alternate non-human expressions afforded by the internet in the past and present. To further consider the furry fandom's development alongside the widespread adoption of the internet, I found it beneficial to turn to written works from the 90s and early aughts about virtual communities that both challenge and support the idea of computer-mediated communications as tools with liberatory potential. So, the furry fandom has had an inclination towards utopianism for a long time. Furries generally hold the belief that their fandom has always been at the forefront of advancements in virtual communication, and there's a lot of evidence to back up this generalization. One of the first bulletin board systems, launched all the way back in 1982, was the Tiger's Den, a forum that would almost exclusively host funny animal storyboards by the end of 1983. Mark Merlino proclaimed in this essay published in the Conference 3 Conbook in 1992 that virtual universes like Furry Muck were the wave of the future, and it seems like furries are leading the way. On the Muck, your gender, age, national origin, physical appearance, and species didn't matter. You could sincerely present yourself as an original anthropomorphic character, be seen that way by others, and what that looked like was entirely up to your imagination. So throughout the 90s, scholars were having these conversations about cyber-utopianism in a broad context that reached beyond the furry fandom. Author Howard Rheingold writes in his 1992 book, The Virtual Community, about The Well, an early virtual community founded in 1985. Rheingold describes The Well as a place where one can connect with others instantaneously and remotely, fundamentally changing the nature of human relationships. He asks the reader to consider which scenario seems more conducive to democracy, a world in which a few people control communications technology that can be used to manipulate the beliefs of billions, or a world in which every citizen can broadcast to every other citizen. It was popular to regard forms of mass media like television and radio as actively diminishing civil liberties, and the internet seemed like an unprecedented opportunity for the individual to seize control of communications technologies. While many scholars had conviction in this idea, some didn't, like essayist Carmen Hermosillo, who mostly published online under her username Humdog. Reading her essay Pandora's Box now seems eerily predictive in some ways. She argues that participants of online communities weren't liberating themselves, but paying with their money, attention, and private information to companies for, quote, the privilege of commodifying and exposing themselves. She explains the virtual communities encouraged people to alienate themselves from the real world in favor of being fed repackaged content that affirmed their own beliefs. Humdog had been a participant on The Well too. She saw the death of a female community member turned into a spectacle and explained that she felt herself being boxed and inventoried by her peers. And the population of cyber-utopianism waned into the 21st century, and by 2000, the dot-com bubble burst as the companies who had rushed to conduct businesses online following the release of Mosaic burned through their venture capital and failed in an oversaturated market. That was kind of the nail in the coffin for any widespread view of the internet as a place with limitless potential. Rheingold published a new edition of his book that same year. He wanted to explain how small the subculture of early users had been when he wrote it. Just a few technophiles and researchers, he called them, numbering in the thousands, and how quickly things had changed in the years following the publication of his book. Commercial activity on the internet had been legally forbidden when he wrote it, only legalized in 1994, so Rheingold saw online communication tools transform into what he called public goods. He feared that these tools may actually do little to challenge the society they exist in, instead perpetuating a corporate ideology that impeded dissenting opinions and limited the potential for freedom. But 30 years later, the furry fandom has sustained its optimism about the internet's facilitation of non-human embodiment. And it makes sense that digital natives in the fandom, people who often share the formative experience of being exposed to Sparklefurs on gallery websites, who then encountered others who shared their interest in anthropomorphic animals for the first time, might be interested in taking up Sparklefurs as objects that exemplify the unique condition of their generation. They grew up alongside a rapidly changing internet landscape that once appeared to offer opportunities for connection and creative expression, but might not anymore. Using DeviantArt today feels like walking through a ghost town. Bot accounts have completely clogged the homepage and search results with AI art. In journalist Matt Baum's article titled "How Furries Are Making Virtual Reality Actually Worth Visiting," he quotes one furry who comments that VR chat is like the early days of the internet. It's like the Wild West and anything's possible. Furries see VR chat as a legacy of the fandom's involvement in the construction of the earliest virtual worlds, even as the game's privacy policy outlines manners in which the company can provide user data, like account information, preferences and settings, in-game communications, movement tracking information, to third-party vendors and analytics services. So, regarding contemporary sparkle fur personas as perfectly preserved relics of the past is complicated. Another example of this is that on Furry Muck, while a player's character might share a lot of similarities to them, the two are distinct individuals. For most furries now, their persona is them, or an embodied expression of their own desires. Developing a persona invites a person to look inwards. I possess these traits, so my persona does too. Or inversely, I have a sparkle dog persona, so I have the traits of a sparkle dog. Essentializing oneself, the fandom, or its visual culture as possessing inherent qualities risks obscuring the more complex dynamics at play. Sparklefurs have come to represent a pivotal moment in the lives of the furries who have been influenced by them, and it remains important that the fandom continues to foster spaces where individuals critically and curiously examine how their identities, artistic practices, and relationships with others connect to the fandom's history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. I'm not biased. I love Sparklefurs, so that was great. The last presenter is going to be Juniper Clark, who's going to be presenting on Chasing Our Tails, Trans-Species Critique and Coalitional Politics.
Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many critters here. It's so exciting. Yeah, why not, right? I just want to give another thank you to the organizers and to PLU for putting this on. This is awesome. Also to my co-panelists and everybody else who's presented today for such amazing work. I'm June Clark. I'm a PhD candidate in the music department at the University of Pennsylvania, where I live and teach on Lenape land in Philadelphia. And in the time I have today, I'd like to take a little bit of time to think about the roles that furry plays in both resisting and reproducing anthropocentric modes of relation that remain foundational to Western understandings of humanness and animality. So I think this paces in step with a lot of the other panelists as well. It's nice to be on the trans-therian panel. I'll try to carry that torch a little bit. So for me, these questions have emerged a little bit out of the early stages of my dissertation project, which looks broadly at discourses around the production and circulation of fur, both real fur as well as faux fur, throughout the 20th and 21st centuries in North America and parts of Europe, as well as how these weigh on broader conceptualizations of Western divisions between organicism and artificiality, aliveness, deadness, human and non-human in nature and culture. The latter part of this project in particular involves thinking about how faux fur is mobilized in furry and therian spheres as a sort of queer, trans, post-natural object assemblage of sorts that does important work in figuring and realizing the playful, kind of celebratory, literally transformative aspects of our cultural practices, while at the same time forces us to contend with how our communities are shaped by wider, maybe extra-communal, we could say, histories of colonial resource extraction, animal agriculture, and human exceptionalism that maybe aren't as commonly indexed in the sort of traditional historiography of furry as fandom. And Alec, we need to talk about faux fur later. So this is just a general overview. If anybody's interested in these questions, this research is ongoing and kind of ethnographic, so I'd love to talk to people about it. So as the proverbial animal fandom, right, we spend a great deal of time and energy with this thing we call animality, often in an anthropomorphized register where the incorporation of non-human characteristics into the personal fashioning of the self does particular work towards, self-actualization or identity formation or exploration or play or fabulous speculation or community building or, what have you. This is, more or less the classical account of furry. And this remains true in a lot of senses, even if a lot of us, and a lot of us who are present today too as well, are interested in kind of beginning to complicate and nuance this premise, right? However, despite the depth of care for other forms of life characteristic of these affective entanglements, the fundamental assumptions of what we mean when we evoke animality or invoke animality have tended to go relatively unquestioned. even as these assumptions can take wildly different shapes depending on one's degrees of engagement or angles of approach to the fandom. So what is an animal really, right? For that matter, what is a human? What can the histories and deployment of these categories reveal about the broader power structures that have produced our conditions of possibility? And what might it mean to claim the animal at the beginnings and ends of our worlds, amidst the widespread species extinctions, genocide, climate collapse, land dispossession, and ecological destruction orchestrated by no other than the human? If, writ large, our recourse to animality often operates as a strategy of survival, in the sense that to play as the non-human is to play in spite of the human body and its existential baggage, where might we begin to locate quote-unquote living animals and not simply abstracted species essentializations in performances of and identifications with animality? Beyond one-dimensional critiques that simply reduce non-human identity formation and performances of animality to something like animal drag, which is a comparison we might want to nonetheless engage with in its own right, what might a configuration of furriness or therianism that takes seriously the proverbial debts we owe to our non-human kin look like? Be they aesthetic, cultural, political, material semiotic, or otherwise. And so one sort of tools that I think can help parse these histories and perhaps begin to offer ways through the thorniness characteristic of existence under this current state of affairs, current crisis state of affairs, is something I like to refer to as trans-species critique. So in general, this mode of critique emerges out of scholarship across critical animal studies and multi-species studies and all the allied fields that are kind of wrapped up in that, which are fields that I think can speak particularly well to this new weird and messy disciplinary constellation that's becoming furry studies that we're all involved in today. Specifically, I'd like to briefly and generally, very generally, introduce two lines or spheres of inquiry that furry as a whole and in its diversity of parts might benefit from reflexively considering. The original paper was like 4 times as long. So if you have any, if you're interested in these sorts of things or they resonate in particular ways and you want to talk more, please come chat with me afterwards. So first is what many in animal studies have historically referred to as the figure of the animal, which in the long history of Western thought takes the form of the construction of a category of being ontologically different from and usually hierarchically below the human. More than this, however, the figuration of animality and discourses of species gesture towards the processes by which humans come to know, or maybe more accurately, assume or imagine what other animals are or are not. So to give a kind of brief example, I'm a fox, we're going to use a fox example. So in her 1992 ethnography of a fox hunting community in New Jersey's Pine Barrens, anthropologist Mary Hufford writes, quote, "The fox, nearly wholly dog nor wholly cat, mediates the oppositions it embodies, male and female, nature and culture, home and abroad, sociable and unsociable, food and not food, insider and outsider, concrete and abstract. As a cat-like dog on the margins of society, the fox also threatens the reality that rest on such agreed-upon distinctions." Hufford's situated account signals a pervasive historical trend that reaches much wider than the North American mid-Atlantic. Foxes have long occupied a liminal space in the Western cultural imaginary, favorites of storytellers, folklore, and mythology, yet often vilified due in part to their uncomfortable proximity to humanness, particularly in behavior and appearance. At various times and on various accounts, foxes embody betweenness as the emblematic tricksters of folklore. Edmund Leach, another anthropologist, notes that foxes in many cultural milieux occupy the, quote, borderline between edible and inedible field animals, or edible field and inedible wild animals, rather, to the degree that eating a fox often carries with it the same taboo as human cannibalism. Foxes also come to be simultaneously gendered, depending on what they're positioned against, either male or female, while at the same time typifying androgyny. Foxes also tend to bounce, both legally and colloquially, between the status of vermin and protected species. In human imaginaries, the fox is charming but a thief, alluring but a rather pungent pest, and particularly and paradoxically under anthropocentric regimes, an animal that is intelligent. In a sense, foxes seem to trade in ferality, not quite domestic, not quite wild, too close to be nature, yet too far to be culture. Furality, despite the term's transitive or liberatory potential, itself cannot make sense without its imbrication within the schisms of the wild and domestic, pure and impure, natural and unnatural, given and made. And so the perennial problem in talking in terms of the animal, to gloss Jacques Derrida, is that this ridiculous umbrella category, he says, like, what a word it is, the animal, right? Subsumes neither a species, nor gender, nor an individual, but an irreducible living multiplicity of mortals under that common label of radical alterity. The animal, as a concept, like the non-human as a concept, reduces the irreducible, all while pretending not to. Importantly, and maybe kind of obviously, the fox is not a fox. In the same way that the Aesopian fox, or Reynard, or Robin Hood, or whichever fox you want to pick, are not, for example, those who are held captive for their skin within fur farms. Both occupy radically different, if intimately entwined, registers of world-making. And yet, popular discourses that retreat to essentialisms would seem to indicate otherwise. For many humans, foxes are cunning, and they are sneaky. Foxes become these things through millennia of cultural ossification, material semiotic conflation cum anthropocentric meaning-making. And so I think this problematic presents a particular bind for the material speculative terrains of furry, which tends to rely heavily on these constructions, even as it just as often questions and complicates them. Does furry reify or muddle these dominant taxonomies of species? I don't really have an answer to this question. Maybe we can also chat about this later. But I suspect it's a mix of both, where the dual practices of identification and creative hybridization serve to reproduce existing stereotypes characteristic of species discourses, while at the same time fundamentally expose the specious logics embedded in conceptualizations of the animal. So on the other side of this coin, we can also ask who gets to be human and under what circumstances? And there exists like a long intellectual history of critical redress against post-Enlightenment claims to and theories of liberal humanism, wherein the human figures as a naturalized, universal, Eurocentric, white, rational, what have you, subject hierarchically distinct from other in subhuman, animal, plant, etc. Forms of being. And remember that species discourses themselves emerge out of these kind of settler colonial practices of categorization initially. In such context, the category of the human, which is essential to Western philosophical and scientific constructions of subject and objecthood, is made dialectically functional through the ontological exclusion and omission of that which is not human. In the long history of European imperialism and settler colonialism, these exclusions often materialize in violent processes of dehumanization, consummated through chattel slavery, colonial dispossession and resource extraction, and genocide carried out against marginalized communities. Liberal humanism and its epistemic vestiges thus reveal themselves to constitute modernity's hegemonic ethnoclass of the Western bourgeois subject. That's a lot of words, but man, capital M, as Sylvia Wynter has written, quote, overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself. So man, as this construction, is what people point to when they say the human in this kind of, schema, right? And while correctives to the coloniality of humanism since its installment in Eurocentric epistemologies of subjecthood have taken many forms and spring from a variety of critical traditions that crisscross hemispheric boundaries, among the most influential intellectual lineages that has found purchase in Western academic theorizations of the post-human subject emerges out of Black studies, particularly as it has been imagined both in its institutional formalization in the American university ecosystem from like the 1960s onward, as well as in its more historical genealogies grounded in abolitionist movements of the 18th and 19th centuries. Central to critiques of Enlightenment rhetorical claims to the universality of freedom under a rubric of generalized, white humanity, white in quotes, humanity in quotes, right, are moves that throw into relief how liberal humanism, far from its professed ideals, has been foundational to the production and preservation of hierarchical distinctions between humans, and presumes particular forms of embodiment and excludes or marginalizes others. And that's from Saidiya Hartman. So, if historical formulations of the minoritized human and animal subject have tended to characterize such bodies as variously in or non or subhuman to violent exclusionary ends, then how might we, as furries or animals or critters or what have you, look to forge alliance across species lines and in opposition to narrow conceptions of subjecthood that often exclude other forms of life? While importantly different in scope from the rejections of humanism that furry often performs, these traditions of critical redress largely, but not only emergent from black feminist thought, indigenous studies, and decolonial theory more broadly, can invite us to think laterally across sites of struggle against dominant forms of oppression that rely on the human to operate. And this, kind of lateral movement of coalition building and category refusal is where the kind of transness of this thing I'm calling trans-species critique comes in. Transing, as Kaji Amin writes, can name, quote, this process of troubling taxonomy, usually by crossing or entangling two or more categories of ontologized being. And admittedly, I cannot think of the practices of furries and therians as anything other than trans, something that Alec brought up as well, I think. So while transness cannot, as Kaji Amin reminds us, function as an unambivalent antidote to the ills, quote, the ills in ontology of taxonomy, as transness, along with vitality, movement, affect, must not simply be imagined as somehow prior to power. It offers a potential effective orientation to radical difference that finds purchase up against this alterity, rather than getting stuck in the so-called gap of incommensurability. To be an animal carries with it the weight of fraught historicities and the levity of utopian hopes. Even the mundane and magical act of renaming oneself, as we do, often away and in opposition to hegemonic humanity, participates in imagining the radical possibilities of change ushered in by poetry, giving name to the nameless so it can be thought. And that's from Audre Lorde. To reconfigure oneself in language, name, and or pronoun, J. De Leon suggests, is to indulge in an idea of another way of being in the world, to imagine a way into or out of something binding, and to hold open space for a different sense of movement for oneself instead. And maybe coming full circle from Rod's, ideas about movement, we're drawn to movement, right? It is in part this different sense of movement, of moving, and of moving differently that hold open the thresholds of our futurity. Put simply, we must move across different radical movements to survive what is to come. This requires both communalism and a healthy respect for difference, and perhaps at times maintaining measured distance, recognizing the thresholds of commensurability. Again, to maybe come full circle again from Rod, not simply reconciling difference, but living in mutual regard with each other. Our myriad struggles are importantly different, but we remain in strategic alliance against those who would police the boundaries of what is human and what is not. And so at the end of it all, not that far in the end. At the end of it all, I linger on Audre Lorde's love poem for Judith. Hanging out means being together upon the earth, boulders, crepe myrtle trees, fox and deer at the watering hole, not quite together, but learning each other's ways. Thank you.
Wonderful presentations. And to go forward, sorry, I know I'm going to ask, can anybody who is in person who presented could come up stage for Q&A? And because we do not have any questions on Slido yet, is there any questions for the audience? Oh, there's two more now? We'll do in person first, and then we'll go to Slido. I have one question right here first.
This is a question for two of the presenters. I forgot your guys' names, but the one who's talking about Sparklefurs and also the presenters who are talking about trans laws. This is coming from the perspective of someone who a couple years ago was once like an out trans teen, and I think that in discussions of like trans youth and also furry youth, and like I think a lot of that is overlapping. There's a lot of sort of removing of people's autonomy and like youth's ability to think and like intellectualize for themselves, and like a lot of times aren't even involved in these conversations and are being argued around. And it's like this assumption that like if someone is under the age of 18, they're completely unable to have any sort of like intellectual thought or like form their own communities or form their own sense of identity. I don't know, I just wanted to hear you guys' thoughts about like sort of youth autonomy.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about that a lot while writing my thesis and making this presentation, just because I also felt like I was in a position of being a kid and longing for something. I perhaps didn't even have the words to articulate, like being an animal, or even things as simple as like wanting to dress a certain way and thinking my parents wouldn't like it, wanting to have like wings and claws and fangs and not being able to articulate that. And I think the fact that those kids are growing up now is why you see a lot of Sparklefur personas. Like, well, I couldn't have that when I was a kid. I couldn't look that way. I couldn't present myself that way. I didn't have the language to, or I didn't think I was allowed. And now I have the means. Now I can draw, or now I have money to commission someone else. And something I didn't talk about in my presentation or my paper, but that I've also observed is that there are a lot of minors, a lot of tween artists who didn't live through the period I'm talking about and also have this like manufactured internet nostalgia, like secondhand, like they weren't there, but they have Sparkle Dog personas too, because they've come to represent a particular moment where, you know, the internet was like a portal to a world in which you could embody this stuff you couldn't have in real life. You didn't know how to ask for it in real life, or you didn't have the means to, and now you do through this character that you've made yourself. Hopefully that addresses some things you were thinking about when you asked that question.
I was going to say, Caro, maybe you could take our side of that, because I think you're a little more in that conversation.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great point. I spend a lot of time thinking about who the law sees as a person and how that kind of appears differently across a lot of different gradients, including age. Minors are not considered to be rights-bearing citizens in most legal settings. And so there's a really interesting thing that happens here with just, trans legislation in general, how it came back attacking minors. You know, I talked about those two waves, right? The first wave of bathroom bills and the second wave was really a return around what can we sell people on? And it's that youth and like this sort of, that children have a version of play that interrupts legitimacy is really the underlying thread in a lot of these laws. And it's this like concept that a child's understanding of themselves cannot be genuine and cannot be supported in these sort of ways. And this really gets, it's the reason that so many of these laws are targeting minors, is that this sort of cultural narrative goes a long distance in the US right now. I think it's really important to pay attention to and really important to critique as much as we can and to really like shape agency and wholeness into our assessments of children.
Cool, thank you. I have an online question first, and then I'm going to go back to an audience. But this question is for Juniper. Have you heard of or considered applying, I'm going to say this name wrong, Maldonado Torres' concept of the human/near human/non-human colonial structure to furry subject formation?
Is that Maldonado Gomez Torres?
Thank you so much.
Okay, yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I'm familiar. I need to do a deeper reading of their work. Could you repeat the last part of that question?
Oh, yes. The concept of human, near human, non-human colonial structure to furry subject formation.
Yes. So, I guess the short answer is I'm passingly familiar with the work. I cut actually a lot of the actual citations and like discussions of various theories, because there are a lot these days. Animal studies has an interesting kind of theoretical and critical genealogy, because it, kind of started by grasping at these maybe more surface level understandings of like difference across species lines, where, the animal or like animality itself becomes figured as some kind of difference, but the kind of renewed focus on race and coloniality is something that has emerged in the last 15 or 20 years. And I think that's kind of the most exciting part of work in animal studies, although not all, theorists that work in that vein would call themselves animal studies scholars. So yeah, again, the answer is yes, and I'm excited to, my dissertation actually deals a lot with kind of colonial formations of subjecthood, particularly when we're thinking about, I'm looking at fur as like a general kind of concept and material trace, but also like something that's in this weird interstitial space between living and not living. And, depending on the ontology you want to play into, some, it's either dead or alive, or, carries some sort of resonance from, the living animal it was a part of. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. I'm excited to read more in that regard.
Audience question. I'll go here first, and then I'll go back to online. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. So before, I just want to say I really, really appreciate like everyone giving the talk. It's really awesome. So I just want to basically so I'm also a trans and Ethereum person who also happens to be an immigrant. So I'm basically like a prime target for this rising fascism government. And it's like, as what Alex and Caro have discussed, furries and basically to an extent like Therian. I mean, they really talk about Therian, but they use furries because whatever becomes like a prime target for like the because like we are being seen as this vulnerable like out group that is an easy victim, but in my perspective, I think we are one of the most resilient group. The fact that we're even like here right now shows like how resilient and tough we are. But that kind of like parallel from like what Belle have said before, kind of there's like certain subset group of individual that kind of like, oh, we're not like that. We're actually like very normal. You know what I mean? Kind of like this sort of like pick me behavior that's been like existing primarily from like younger furries. For a lack of a better word, I'm gonna use the term like pureteens. And I'm just like, like we all know that this pick me behavior will not make it better for anyone. So I'm just wanna like hear, because there's something that also like bothers me a lot, hearing from like a queer or Therian or like feminist perspective about like how do we address this like divisive view from like an in-group divisive view on handling this issue, and like what strategy we need to like basically address this and makes it like a solution, especially like facing this rising authoritarianism government. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I have like thoughts about this, but if anyone else wants to talk about it as well. I mean, I think it's this is like a classic like issue that happens with like most marginalized groups, right? Like this idea of like assimilationism, and the idea that if one conforms to like a norm, like a hegemonic norm, to like enough, eventually they'll be included within the sort of in-group, or they will serve as like a model option to choose from among the in-group to spare, or from the out-group to spare like the oppression of the hegemonic forces, whatever. I don't know. But I think something that is interesting in furry is that there is this historical group of people from like pretty early on that are like not comfortable, that are like they're pushing away all of the things that make furry interesting. Trans people, gay people, like NSFW, art, whatever, be it burned furs or, any of their predecessors or antecedents. I think it's something that's really interesting to me is the way that they have been like systematically excluded after a certain point from furry spaces. And I actually think that's something that as a community we do really well, right? Is like when there's somebody that is like violating these norms of inclusivity that we try and cultivate in our spaces, like you kick them out, right? Like that's, I mean, this is like maybe random, but my sort of coming to culture as a person, like when I was a kid, was like punk music, and there's sort of a truism that like if you start letting like Nazis hang out at your bar, it'll become a Nazi bar, so you got to kick them out. And I think that's really something that I see furry as exemplary of, is like a community which is comfortable enforcing those boundaries, at least in a lot of its elements. And I think that's part of why it is resilient, like you said, is because we're not uncomfortable doing that. I don't know. Sorry if that was like a weird roundabout answer, but I think like it's about taking action and praxis, really.
I can say something briefly about it, maybe. I was also just thinking as you were talking, I think a large part of this sort of, you say Puritan, and that's kind of that's right? It's mostly young people trying to do the whole respectability will save us thing when that's not going to save us, spoiler alert, right? I think part of the reason why it's maybe so prominent in furry is because of the online component of the fandom. You know, when we do stuff like this, right, we don't really have those problems. It's the kind of, you know, showing up in person for your community. That's what makes us resilient. And I think it's just a feature of how online spaces are structured, where, you know, anybody can kind of say anything with little to no consequences sometimes. Maybe kind of allows for the more, you know, kind of ill-informed young conservatism to flourish. But yeah, that's just my 2 cents on it.
Thank you. I'm going to do one more online question, and then we'll have one more time for your question too. And the question I have here is, it's from Alec. Are you here with us, Alec?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Hello.
It's a question for June.
Hi, Juniper. I adored your presentation. I adored how in conversation our presentations were. And I really, I really loved your point about, I believe the phrase is cultural ossification over time, as well as the thought of furriness as, you know, this kind of thing that reifies tropes as well as anthropocentric perspectives on animals. And something I'd like to pick your brain about, because you were like, I don't have all the answers to this. I don't either. I wish I did, but I wouldn't be here if I did. I think that it really is something that I've been toying with, is this kind of perspective on the visual. As a art historian in a past life, it kind of speaks to how I see the world. But a lot of what I feel is that sort of ossification is the visual components of how we've rendered animals in the furry fandom. And this is not whatsoever some kind of rant against visual art, but rather understanding how we kind of create these archetypes through things like Disney's visual media and, you know, the cartoons that are in children's books and so on and so forth. And I'm curious as to what kind of dialogue we can have as a general, you know, we meaning largely, about that kind of visual component. Is this something that you see in alignment with your theory of fighting back against this ossification or anything as something that we need to divest from? Are these kind of visual outputs? I mean, respect to the Sparkle Dogs, love the Sparkle Dogs, but are some of these ways that we render furry culture visual kind of actually a way of doing that ossification? Or is this something that maybe we shouldn't even really critique at all and we should go full speed ahead with? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that to continue that conversation about ossification, and I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a great question, and I'm going to give a very brief answer, but again, let's chat. Let's chat later. Yeah, so the visuals, it's interesting because I'm kind of coming at it from this perspective. So I'm in the Department of Music. I, you know, credentially, I'm a musicologist. I'm not really a musicologist. I mostly, my, you know, engagement with music comes through sound studies. So my, you know, my broad work deals with like sound studies, trans studies, animal studies. That's kind of what I, you know, market myself as essentially. And I really like your point about like how this, you know, this kind of species reification extends or like, you know, functions through the visual a lot of the time. And there's this kind of conceit that we deal with in sound studies, kind of this campaign against the regime of the visual, because we're, you know, sound studies scholars, and we're like, yeah, this is our sense. We like to hear things, right? Everybody loves to see things, but that has foreclosed like how we're thinking about a lot of, you know, various kinds of analytics. And I think it's particularly salient in furry because of the, you know, emphasis on visual art that our communities kind of, you know, are drawn to and kind of fashion the self out of. So I think the visual might, you know, I think if I'm getting your question, it's like, oh, is the visual foreclosing in some sense ideas about species or, you know, ways of being in the world? And I think yes, but also I'm curious in my dissertation, actually, I'm looking at like, how does the sonic do this? Not to say that, you know, I think you're right in that the visual, you know, this kind of rendering of like symbolism. And actually, I was thinking of Nicole Shukin when you were thinking, or yeah, Nicole, if I'm remembering correctly, Nicole Shukin about rendering capital, rendering animal as capital, referring, you know, it's not like 3D renderers literally kind of like render something into the visual. She links it also to the actual like rendering of animal life into animal product, or like, the kind of displacement of subject into object via meat. I'm looking at it via fur, right? So I definitely think the visual is involved there in a considerable degree. But the part of the work that I didn't really talk about today, but I'm really, really interested in thinking about with everyone, is like for me, it's like how do vocalizations, specifically like this kind of like we bark, we meow, we hiss at each other, right? That's kind of one of the pillars of intracommunal sociality, right? Is we feel free to like meow, at each other, and we feel comfortable to do that, right? But at the same time, that's also a kind of ossification of ideas about what species sound like, and it's my like very, very surface level, haven't written my dissertation yet, reading of it is that like, yeah, it does these things for us, but it also kind of relies on the evacuation of any kind of like semiotic or like meaningful content that like if a cat meows, they're saying something. If we meow, we're approximating what a cat sounds like and kind of taking this, we're putting our own meaning into it, but it's this kind of weird terrain that is full of these kind of contradictions and tensions. So I'll stop that there, but yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I really appreciate the engagement.
And thank you, that was a wonderful answer.
One more question, and then we'll close it. Oh, sorry.
I'm going to start off by addressing the last person's questions. Hey, artists, humans come in many body shapes. Furries should too. Thank you. My question is for Alex and Caro, actually. Old dude, so I'm not as nimble on the internet as I would like to be with a lot of things. So a lot of times it's hard to separate the wheat from the chaff and separate the truth from the rumor and so on and so forth. But when we first started hearing about the whole schools accommodating furry students and the litter box and all of that routine, there was I don't know what else to call it, a meme going around at that time that what that whole shenanigan actually was started by self-appointed funny people on the left, started that rumor to make fun of the right-wing people who were going after trans rights by just showing them how ridiculous it could sound. And then when this got revealed, the right stuck with their playbook of, well, when you're proven wrong, double down on the wrongness. Rather than admitting you were wrong, just take your wrongness and go with it as if you were right. Have you heard anything about that angle on it?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, there's like a lot of other hoaxing and like definitely mockery of the right from the left. I don't believe that this started as one. It started, as you can see, there was that blog post from back in 2016, and there's been rumors about like litter boxes in schools for like decades. I was not really connected with furry until around 2021 when it started in Canada at these like school board meetings, and then it migrates to the United States in like early 2022, where it really takes off because of libs of TikTok. I will say there was a furry hoax on libs of TikTok after this, wherein a group of furry pranksters made a fake person, like a fake email account, and then made fake like worksheets, like elementary school worksheets that were like, make your fursona. Here's like a word search, like a furry word search that has like musky in it and stuff. And then they artificially aged them and took a picture with like a homework folder and sent it to libs of TikTok like, my second grader brought this home from school. And then immediately she posted it. And it got on like Fox News and stuff like that. Another sort of way that you can really like, I think the point they were trying to make is like demonstrating this like insane pipeline. Obviously they revealed it was a hoax and whatever. So there was some of that, but as far as I'm aware, the litter boxes hoax was not started by the left, although I think that many people after the fact took it on as like a, look how absurd this is that people are caring about this. And that was repeated in like mainstream democratic spaces as well.
And I know I said one more, but how could I say no? Go for it.
Thank you very much for letting me ask my question, because it feels very important to me and can kind of crosses with maybe the last couple questions and goes out to potentially all of y'all. But as I'm very visibly trans, furry, and animal, and wanting to assume, desiring to assume that position as much of a positive force as I can be, or any one of us can be, and to be a responsible node and participant in coalition building. I'm wondering your informed insights on, what the move is, or what effective strategies we have to, push back, redirect, and deconstruct the sort of moral panic and antagonization. Thank you.
Who wants to jump in? Because I think this is such a goated question.
Does anybody up there? Anyone?
I can go if yeah. I mean,
yeah, go for it.
I wasn't the one who used coalition building in my presentation, so I kind of ended it there. But I love this question. My cheeky answer is everyone should read Brian Masumi's What Animals Teach Us About Politics. My real answer is a little more complicated than that. I really think that when it comes to utilizing the language of Juniper Clark's presentation and this idea of coalition building, the way that I see it is understand nature as culture. I think that there is a really big divide between the ways that, and this is literally an argument that Brian Masumi makes, but also an argument that James Bridle makes, and also an argument that some other Deleuze-Guattarian people especially like to make, that a lot of us see this kind of nature-culture divide as something that we take for granted, but in reality, a lot of what we see in nature is culture by any other name. If you saw a species interact with other members of its species, you might call that nature. But in reality, if we put that into a cultural context, it is quite literally just how they function in a social group, or how their sort of ideologies, so to speak, manifest in these particular closed circuit contexts. And I think that moving forward, something that really enlightened me, and I do absolutely 100% take this from James Bridle's Ways of Being, which I believe came out just this year. So shameless plug, hashtag not sponsored. But thinking about this text as kind of a way of saying, we can't necessarily resist every single thing that we see, but if we are to resist climate collapse and also anthropocentrism and also a lot of the kind of regime-focused technologies, shout out AI, that are emerging at this time to kind of capitalize literally on this sense of collapse, we need to understand to echo Clark's words, entanglements and the ways that our particular subject positions are literally just that, subject positions. And if we recognize these as entanglements, if we recognize that everyone has a subject position, including, every single animal on Earth, then we recognize the possibility of creating not just a coalition in Clark's words, but also these ecologies of meaning that go beyond and kind of sort of not just go beyond our human sensibility, but also return us to a sense of responsibility to nature. Because this isn't about elevating nature to the level of culture. It's recognizing that everyone has culture. And in that way, understanding those ecologies and those connections bring us to a higher sense of being, responsibility, and connection.
I actually realized I do want to say something. That was a great response. And I think something else that I was thinking about is I think I got from your question also, how do we get people to not be shitty to furry and trans people without going into an assimilationist mindset or taking assimilationist actions or performing it in that way. And I think the main thing I would say that I have had really great success with personally, although I am also realizing that I'm dressed like a fucking grad student up here, the most normie looking person in this room. But something, oh, that was loud. Something that I think is really important is also like organizing, like get involved, not in your community, be in community with people outside of furry, and don't be afraid to share yourself with them entirely. Organize a union, do mutual aid, get involved with your local political scene. Like those are all things that you can do, and people will see you out in the world, and suddenly this abstract notion of like, who are these people? Why are they indoctrinating my kids? Like, why are they in school? Suddenly it's like you're like a being in their life that is more than just like a media text that they have like, absorbed from somewhere else. You become like, you become a subject to them, And I think that's like the most important thing that I think we should be doing as furries, because I think we have immense political potential as like a community of marginalized people primarily, like to take action together and to really shape this world, like Alec was saying, for justice, and to really protect so many of the things that we see crumbling and falling apart right now.
And I'm just co-signing what they just said, because I think it's very necessary. So on one hand, organizing obviously I think is a very important, it's just necessary, I think, in this day and age. And what I just maybe to like slide between the more like multi-species coalitional or coalition building, I guess, and the kind of recognizing how animality or our kind of plights are directly informed and contribute to and are interlocked with these other kinds of fights we're fighting on other fronts, is like there's a concept from multi-species ethnography, which is where it's kind of an anthropological field or set of methods that is really interested in thinking about how in the classical anthropological account, oh god, I can't talk. We look at a set of human cultural practices or a setting, right? And we try to determine, what exactly is going on. Multi-species ethnography tries to, say, hey, like there are a multitude of forms of life beyond the human and next to the human, and more important than the human in a lot of senses, that's going on here, right? So there are other forms of life that are present, and Anat Singh, who's a multi-species ethnographer, anthropologist, cultural theorist, she writes about how we should cultivate what she calls like arts of noticing, which is just kind of like trying to get down and think about what produced whatever conditions of possibility are germane to whatever setting you're looking at. So like here we can talk about the field of the room, we can talk about who is here, the work that is needed to produce this kind of event, the labor, the actual labor and people that are involved in producing this, both visible and invisible. But also, like whose land are we on? Who are we displacing, human or otherwise? When we go out and, go for a bite to eat, like who are we eating? Stuff like that. You can kind of go on and on and on and on and on about these questions. But yeah, so I think these like kind of arts of noticing, though, like, they're used often in these like animal studies contexts, you can apply them to kind of any kind of situation you're in to try to like really get down to, how are we connecting with others and like what are we ignoring when we take things for granted.
Thank you all. Thank you all for truly